Did you know that my business partner, Josh Citron, and myself have been offering a Yoga of Business course? Well, I want to make sure that you do. We've been doing it for a few months now, and it's been really going well. We've been learning a lot. First thing that we learned is that it's not just for yoga teachers, it's for any independent creators who are trying to navigate this new landscape that we're all in. We've been discussing how to succeed without social media. We've been talking about how to create content and let that do the marketing for you. We've talked about sustainability over unlimited growth. We've talked about how to choose your digital tools. And most importantly, we've been talking about how to create a new bliss money balance. And I'm mentioning it again here because we're doing something special this coming month. We just concluded 2020, and at the end of the year, we always do a complete analysis of our numbers. We whip out the spreadsheets, and we look at exactly how much money we made, where we made it. We compare it to previous years and look for trajectories and trends. And usually it's just me and Josh doing it. But this year we've decided to do it in the Yoga of Business class to share all of those numbers and let people really see under the hood. I think it's going to be informative and useful. So if you've been considering doing the Yoga of Business course or you're just learning about it now, I want to encourage you to check it out. It's the Yoga of Business course with Josh Citron and Jay Brown, and you can find out about it at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome if you're new, and everyone else. What a week that was, huh? Can you believe what happened this week? Maybe I'm just talking to the people in the United States, but no, I think everybody around the world saw it, right? So horrible. On so many levels. Just scary to think that so many people have faith in this president. I don't understand how anybody could think that this person cares about anybody but himself. And the complicity is mind-blowing of the Republican Party, of the Democratic Party too, but especially the Republican Party. It's just gross. The whole fucking thing is gross. It's embarrassing and ludicrous and horrible. And horrible because of deep, ugly strains of who we are in America. You know, the difference between the way police officers treated rioters in the Capitol to protesters trying to save black lives is undeniable. And it's just so ugly. The whole fucking thing's ugly. And, you know, it happened, ironically enough, right as I started to feel a little bit better. Those of you who've been around know I was having a lot of mouth pain because of this tooth extraction. Well, I went to the doctor on Tuesday and she figured it out. We had to make an adjustment to the temporary bridge because when I was eating, I was biting down and aggravating these teeth. So we figured it out and the pain finally subsided. I started feeling better, started getting my state back to its more usual place. And then fucking the world started to fall apart. As though it wasn't already falling apart, though. I mean, let's be real about it. It's not like we couldn't have seen this coming. But when you actually see it, you don't believe it. I don't believe it. It's like surreal. Especially when there's so much pressing shit happening right now. I mean, It's too much. Too much, really. Fortunately, I've got a really fantastic talk for you today with a dear friend named Lucy Karnani. And Lucy is someone I met a few years ago and a trip I took to Australia. We talk about it a little bit at the beginning. She's got a book called Connecting Conscious Communications for Yoga Teachers and Yoga Therapists. And you'll hear, I've had a lot of interaction with Lucy over the last, year and a half especially. And I knew about the work that she did, some just from like offhanded comments and from reading the book, but had never really had a chance to sit down and kind of flesh some of it out with her. And I had a fantastic time doing it with her. And I think it's a wonderful talk for all of us going forward, because being able to communicate consciously and clearly is more important now than ever before, I think. So I was very happy to have connected with her for this conversation, and I'm excited to be sharing it with you today. Before we get to that, let me quickly mention that this episode is brought to you in support by Podcast Premium subscribers. People like Courtney Catriona and Morton Ronning. We're grateful to Courtney and Morton and all of the people who have chosen to be Podcast Premium subscribers. Not only is it a way to have access to the full archives of the show, but it is the best way to help support us in continuing to be able to do this every week as we do. It is a choose your rate, and you can cancel at any time. And if you're in a bad place right now, you don't have any funds, and you want to listen to some of the archive episodes, just email us. We will send you a free account. But if you are in a position to contribute something, it makes a huge difference. You can find out about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber, along with all of my other stuff, my weekly live stream classes, the teacher's call, all of my stuff. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right, I think that is just going to be it. Like I said, there's too much to talk about, and most of it sucks. And, I'm really having to be careful about where I'm putting my attention and for how long. And maybe there's something to talk about there, but I'll save that for the other side. I also could use a little bit of parenting advice. So if you're one of those people who likes intros and outros and you want to stick around to the other side, I will touch base with you there on a few things. But we've got some good stuff to get to here today, and I think we should just get to it. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Lucy Karnani. What's going on? Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. This is a very fun moment for me to get a chance to talk to you like this.
And for me too, yeah.
Well, I was thinking back, and you'll forgive me if I'm not remembering, but did we interact together at all before I met you at the workshop in Sydney in May of 2019? Had we had any email exchanges or anything like that before that workshop?
No. I mean, I'd been a listener since the previous year when you did the whole series on Desika, and that's when I came to you.
Okay.
And I might have written something, but nothing. No. It was really at the workshop is when we first met.
Okay. Well, I kind of have a fun thing to share with you, because I do feel like this conversation is a little bit of a culmination of a moment that we had at the workshop, because you gave me your book at that workshop, Connecting. And it was all about conscious communication for yoga teachers and yoga therapists. And, I'll tell you a funny thing is, that book it's a pretty big book. It's a pretty big, heavy book. And I tend to travel very light, especially when I'm traveling very far, like to the other side of the planet. So, In all honesty, if that book hadn't really piqued my interest, I probably wouldn't have taken it all the way back with me. I'm just being honest with you, because it was a big heavy book, and I would have had to get it into my already tight luggage. But I opened the book up, and I wish I could remember, but I can't remember what page I opened up to, and I realized what the book was about like communication skills. And for me, that's something I've always really been very passionate about. I mean, I learned some of the things that are in your book through theater school, I think. Some of the things like using your voice, and like we can talk about some of those things, maybe like things that you do to communicate clearly, even like speech classes so that you articulate clearly and people can hear you in the back of the room or whatever.
Yep.
So I had some of that, but even more, like I had a memory of my freshman year of college. I had this one design professor, and they asked us to design the cover of our life. Like if your life was a book, what's the cover? And I don't remember it exactly, but I know my choice was, it was just basically blank with text. And the text basically had a title. It was a title that had to do with learning how to communicate with other people.
Love that. Yeah. And you've certainly done that.
but honestly, I tell you that because when you gave me that book and I looked at it, it kind of touched a chord in me. And that's why I hauled it all the way back home.
Well, that's a great endorsement. Thank you, Jay. I feel very honoured by that. And it's interesting about the size of the book that you should bring that up. So as you know, I co-authored it with my friend and colleague Jill Danks, and our process was very interesting because she too came from a similar professional background to me, and in fact we worked in the same corporate organisation from which we've drawn a lot of the materials, if you like, with permission and with blessing, into the yoga world. And our process was, she actually approached me one day and she said, how would you like to write a book together? Given we have all this knowledge. And by that stage, I was already running workshops and, very regularly for yoga teachers in their teacher training program, and also for, at that stage, what was being offered in the studio I worked in was advanced diploma. So for people who were looking to deepen into working one-on-one, and that's now morphed into a yoga therapy training. So that's where that training sits. And so I said to her, you know what, Jill, I have two first reactions. My first reaction is that I've always been told I'm going to write a book, but I had no clue what the topic would be. And then my first reaction is I can't write. And she said, well, that's okay. You talk and I'll write. So you know me a bit, Jay, so you know that fits.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that because I was a talker before I was a writer, and they are a little bit different skills. You can, there's a lot you can get away with when you're speaking that you can't get away with when you're setting the words onto page. Yeah, exactly. So what we did is we sort of started off that way, and I sort of in effect delivered to her what I created for the workshops, and we captured all of that, and then the process from there, really continued to evolve. We studied more into particular areas. We certainly draw on her teaching experience in different areas to mine, and so forth. And so in total, every word in the book has been touched by both of us a number of times. Anyway, we came up with what we called the first draft, and we reached out to a number of friends both here in Australia and also in the US, because I had lived in the US for 17 years, and that's where I'd started my yoga journey. And so we sent it out to the first readers, and one of the very sort of out of about 12 people, probably about 8 people said, this is great, but it's too long. It's just too big. And so we cut it in half. So what you have in your hands is actually, well, it's not quite half. It's probably, 65, 35 or something like that. So there's actually a second book, semi-written, which we're working on at the moment.
And then since this one's published, I've actually had feedback from some people saying it's too big. It should be 2 books. So,
well, let me say this. I didn't find it like content-wise too big, and it has like it's larger font, which I appreciate. You know what I mean? Like I didn't think it was too big that way. I think when I'm traveling and I have to get it in my bag, then it was a little too big. But ultimately, again, I'm really glad I brought it back, and I want to add to that because I think it's also important to mention and just to acknowledge between us as we get into this conversation today that we have had a lot of interaction since then through the teacher's call.
Yes.
And,
yes.
I want to say to you that for me, it was really great to have you in the group after reading your book. And you are a person in my life who has played a pretty vital role. And I don't know if you know that so much, but you are somebody who has been willing to challenge me on things, or not necessarily, maybe challenge isn't the right word, or to point things out to me that might be a little uncomfortable to point out, like in a constructive way, I will add. And I really, really value that. And I used to do that to friends and people I knew. And then when it's done to me, like I get a feeling, when I get that feeling of, oh, I get a little defensive, but there's truth there, that is very exciting to me. So I feel like your use of communication skills in our interactions has been a real proof to what you teach. And I want to compliment you on that and thank you for being that kind of mirror for me, because honestly, I don't have sort of teachers and mentors right now like I might have in the past. In fact, I haven't had teachers and mentors for some time. So the collective thing that we're doing in the teacher's call, and people like you being willing to observe things about me and be willing to feel free to tell me, is just been so rewarding. So I want to take this like public moment even also to thank you for that.
Wow. Well, thank you. And that has touched me very much. Thank you. Is this a strategy that you start off podcast by making your guest teary and emotional?
It's not a strategy, and I don't always have. I'm kidding. No, but I don't always have anything that it would be able to do that with. But in this moment, I do. So, I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't totally relevant to what you teach and everything. You know what I'm saying? Like it is about communication skills. It's not just you wanting to butter you up.
Yeah, thank you. I so appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. And I hope that, I guess, our hope, Jules and my hope when we wrote this book was that would be the energy people would receive from the book, that everything is from a place, of love, really. And, as yoga teachers and yoga therapists, that's what, people in so many ways really come to us for. They might want to learn how to, move their bodies for different reasons. They may have started to learn something about the benefits of breath and so forth, and I could go on and on. But, ultimately, I think people are desperately seeking safe harbor and places where they feel safe and they can trust and they feel that love. And, we could talk for probably an hour and a half about love and all its meanings. And to that end, there are, I guess I don't know any yoga teacher who's come to the profession without an intention to, help other people. And there are a lot of people who have that intention but don't have the skills to be able to have it received that way. And that's what our book, I hope, is, and the work I do is to become pragmatic about it. So, okay, so this is good in theory, but how do I make that happen?
Yeah, and also just the feeling when somebody levels with you, like you feel like you're being communicated to in a clear way that you understand, and then it allows you to be a better communicator too. I don't know. In any case, we could get into that exchange. But I first want to ask you, because I am curious. I know you were recently on the Live Like You Love Yourself podcast with Shara and Maria, like two of my other favorite people, and they did a great job. And I would sort of point people to that because they did a good job doing your whole like yoga journey story. So I'm not going to get into it as much as they did. So I'd be very happy to point people to that podcast as well, because I think they did a wonderful job, and there was a lot in your background. And I know we share some influences, and then you have other influences. But I'm curious more specifically about where this sort of conscious communication ideas and techniques that are in the book come from. Where did you, and I'm sorry, your co-author's name is Jill, is that right?
Jill, that's right, Jill Danks. Yep.
So where did you and Jill get this stuff? Where does it come from?
Yeah, sure. So we both worked with an organization called Rogen International, and that's ROGEN. Not to be confused with the hair product, which it often was in most states in America. And so it's Rogen. And this consulting, was a global consulting and training organization, was founded by Peter Rogen, the person Peter Rogen. And he came to be doing this kind of work in the 60s, in the late 60s. He had a master's in communication from Yale. He was an off-Broadway Shakespearean actor, and he wrote children's books. So he's a very interesting man, and he continues to be a very interesting man. And he had a whole bunch of friends in the advertising world. So imagine like the most creative people on Madison Avenue in the ad agencies in the 60s. And they would be sitting around talking and saying, you know, we have such dumb clients. You know, we have these brilliant ideas and they just don't seem to get it. And they're missing out. And he said, well, maybe it's not your clients. Maybe it's you. You know, maybe you're not communicating it clearly for them to understand your ideas. And they said, well, if you're so smart, then you come in and show us how to do it. And so he started to work with them in what in the advertising world would be called pitch consulting. So he's helping them prepare for their pitch meetings with their clients or potential clients. And they started to get a lot of success. And so they would start to bring him in a lot. And then after a year or two, they said, look, can you teach us how to do it? And so that's when he put together some training. And his first area that he trained in is what he called presentation skills. And he looked at it both from what was required from a planning point of view and an organization point of view, as well as from a delivery point of view. And a lot from that, he drew a lot on his acting experience. So that's why it's not surprising that, given that you studied acting, that you have familiarity with some of the materials that are in there.
Right.
Yeah. And so that was the very birth. And he ran a pretty small operation out of New York City for about 20 years. And then, and in the 80s, he started to travel to teach this stuff around the world. And he was particularly big in the advertising world, in media, and also in the corporate world, in banking and law firms and so forth. And he came out to Australia a few times. And at that time, I was working in media. So I started off my, well, as you said, people can listen to my life story, but I spent 10 years in commercial radio, in sales and sales management. And that's where I came across the materials of Rogen as an organization. And so the main person he worked with in Australia was a man by the name of Neil Flett. And in the late 80s, Peter decided to offer licenses to use his materials to other individuals. And Neil bought the license for Australia and then New Zealand, and then fairly soon after bought the worldwide rights. So Rogen as an organisation became head officed in Sydney from that point on, so the very late 80s, 1990s, sort of 91. And Peter was still the chairman, so he was still very involved, and he still had some consultants working with him in New York. But the sort of geographical centre, what's the word I want? The head office, I guess, was in Sydney, and then we opened in Melbourne and Brisbane and so forth. And so that's when I came to Rogen, and it was when I was working with my last radio network that actually Rogen approached me and said, if you ever leave radio and you're interested, we'd love to, speak with you. And so that's how I came to them. And so during that first 20 years, it was Peter, but very, particularly once he partnered with Neil Flett, And then Neil brought in other really bright individuals from a wide range of experiences. The material started to build. So, as I said, it was kind of initially Peter and then other people. Yeah.
Oh, that's one of my questions is sort of what were the applications of this training? Like, was it all advertising, people wanting to do better pitches, or were there other companies using it in other kinds of ways?
Yeah, great question. We worked in pretty much every industry you can imagine and every professional services sector. Right across the board. We worked from the chairman of the board, CEO level, and the C-suite, right down to, graduate employees. And so the greatest success in organisations was experienced where it started top down. And so it was kind of role modelled by the senior people, the senior management. Some of the clients that Rogan ended up working with around the world were, all of the investment bank with, say, JP Morgan, or with, some of the names don't exist anymore, so I won't bother with all the names, but the really biggest, Chase Manhattan, and the really big, investment banks and private banks and so forth. Similarly with law firms, architectural firms, engineers. For example, one of my favourite clients when I was still in Australia, so I went with Rogan to New York in 1995. I went there for a year, and then it got extended to 2 years and 3 years, and I stayed 17 years. But one of my favourite clients was actually working with architects, because if you think about architects, to become an architect, you have to be pretty creative. But you also have to learn a lot of technical information, almost like an engineer, so chemical stuff and physics and all that. And what I found as a generalization about architects is they're very lovely people who tend not to be pushy with their ideas, whereas you think of like in advertising world or media or even in banking and so forth, them to be more pushy, right? Mm-hmm. And but of course it was absolutely critical. I mean, they had to compete for business with other architectural firms, and and they had to, and the way they did that was, by their communications being clearer. And
so I guess I'm curious then, because you said it sort of started out as like presentation skills, but now it's, I guess when you describe it there, it's almost like everybody has to have that meeting, right? Where you come in to maybe get the job and present your design or whatever, if you're a creative. Mm-hmm. And in that meeting, I guess it is, you need to present well. You need to present yourself and your ideas well. It is presentation skills in a way.
Yeah, except for those meetings, it typically would have happened somewhat down the line in the relationship beginning.
I see.
And so if I had to put labels on the work that Rogan did, it would be presentation skills is where it began. Then negotiation skills was developed. So if you had, gained the contract, then there was often negotiation around the terms and so forth. Then there was selling skills, which depended who we were working with. I'm going to be really blunt here. It depended who we worked with, what we called that. Because in some organisations it was, culturally appropriate to think of there being a sales team, but in other, organisations or institutions, they would be horrified to think of themselves as salespeople. So we called that relationship development, and there's exactly the same skills.
That's for the not-for-profits, right? The not-for-profits aren't allowed to have sales teams, but they have to sell themselves to get funding or whatever, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, that's another whole thing. That's another whole thing too. But I mean, none of the professional services people, like lawyers and engineers and management consultants and bankers, they would hate to think of themselves as being, salespeople in inverted commas. And so, but at the end of the day, if you're a good salesperson, what you're actually good at is building and maintaining relationships.
Mm-hmm. And I stop you just for a second, because when you said that, I guess that's true. But part of me also sometimes thinks like good salesmen are able to like be sort of coercive or manipulative or something. And that was, one of the things there was a big crossover between kind of like coaching and then into the yoga wellness world. There was a time where like a lot of yoga teachers were taking these coaching courses and becoming coaches, and that happens more. And I had someone on the show a while back. We had a conversation about coaching, And I could see how it doesn't necessarily have to be manipulative or coercive, but is there a difference? Is there a difference between the kind of salesmanship that happens when it's about building relationships and the kind of salesmanship where you like pull one over on somebody?
Okay, so I think there's something inherently wrong with the statement that good salespeople are coercive and manipulative. Because I would say bad salespeople try to be coercive and manipulative. That's not skillful. That is, well, manipulative and horrible. I mean, and what? I mean, sorry, I'll cut you off.
No, it's okay. I'm cutting you off. I would say my thought is that it's not that good salesmen are coercive or manipulative. It's just that some of the techniques that are used in sales, even the way we do discount offers and we do all these things in our way we market things that are kind of manipulative. They get us to buy stuff that we don't need or buy more because that's what they're designed to do. I think there's a difference maybe between trying to sell someone something or like an artist trying to like ingratiate or like express their ideas. I don't know. Is there a difference to you?
Huge difference. Huge difference. So what you're talking about there is what I would describe as marketing, not as selling. And marketing is good marketers do understand their target market and do try and speak to them, but it's still very, very general. Whereas in a good relationship manager / salesperson, what they do is the primary goal is to establish rapport, and so that the person with whom they're speaking will open up and feel comfortable. And then the next major skill is listening with the goal of understanding what are their needs. I mean, if you don't understand and I did work in sales. And in fact, actually, just as a little sidebar, I worked in commercial radio and sales management for about 6 years. And at the same time, I was teaching scuba diving. And a person came out on the boat one day, or was in actually one of the programs I was teaching. And he basically offered me a job as promotions manager of Australia's, at the time, largest paper merchant. And I thought, oh, fantastic, I'm going to get away from sales. I hate sales because I had a lot of conflict in myself, identity about, oh, I'm a salesperson. And I came from a long line of professional services people, doctors and teachers and so forth in my family. And so I was totally the black sheep working in commercial radio. And I thought, oh, hooray, I can be legitimate now. I'm going to be in marketing. And so I took on this role and I became the promotions manager. And what I found out was that I really missed being on what I called the pointy end of the ship. So at the point where the relationships were genuinely developed between two people, two individuals, and really understanding their needs. I was that, as a layer or two back from that. So, I had my relationships with the sales force, but I didn't have it really with the clients at the end. And I really, really missed that. And I went back into radio after a year. I mean, I missed it so much. So, I totally hear you. I mean, in my 20s, I was really conflicted about being a salesperson. And of course, salespeople do all sorts of things like call themselves consultants, sales consultants, and sales executive and things like that. So they don't even have to be a salesperson.
I really get that idea of being at the point of the ship. And when you said it all, I thought it was Desikachar and yoga being about relationships. Yeah, but I guess it also sort of depends on like what you're selling, right? If you can feel good about what you're selling people and it's helping people, that's one thing. If you're selling people on something that's not really, whatever, that you don't feel great about, that's something.
Yeah, well, that's sure. And then you absolutely shouldn't be doing that work, You absolutely should be. And certainly by, the end of my 20s, like working in commercial radio in your 20s is a real party. It's fantastic. I had a great time and I met all sorts of,
What was the radio station? What kind of music did the radio station play? Were you selling ads for the radio station? Was that what you were doing?
I was. Yeah, well, the airtime, yeah. So my first few radio stations I worked with are what they called news talk radio.
Okay.
So we had a guy who who was very high profile in the Melbourne market. I was at that point, and very controversial. And he would make headlines himself, like in the newspaper and be on TV because of his controversial nature.
Like a shock jock, huh?
Kind of. But news radio saw themselves as educational, so trying to inform the public in a semi-highbrow way. So, but then later on, I moved into music, and then the last network I worked with was had the number one station in pop music and so forth. So I sort of did the whole lot in terms of the radio scenes, and so I met when I was in News Talk, I met very genuinely interesting leaders in business and politicians and so forth. And then when I was in music, I got to go to lots of concerts for free. So that was fun in my 20s. But, I was definitely needing something more, by that time. And that's when, Rogan arose for me. And coincidence, there are no coincidences. And, what I loved working about with Rogan was the caliber of my colleagues. So everything we did, we worked in a collaborative way, and we collectively, if there was an opportunity to work with a new client, we'd all work together to create the appropriate solution for whatever their needs were. And, we did draw on the materials from our presentation skills, negotiation skills, relationship development, media skills, all of those sorts of areas. But, everything was designed for the specific individuals with whom we'd be working. And so that was my experience in Australia. And then when I went to the US and I landed in our New York office, which was a sort of a newly reopened Rogan in the US, we had just a small team of people, like 4 people, and I made 5. And I brought across all of the pedagogy, if you like, from Australia that had been developed, and trained my colleagues there in that. And then we grew from there. And, over the next few years, opened in Chicago and San Francisco and Boston and so forth. And then the woman who'd been leading up the US operation went to open up in London, and I ended up running North America. And and so what was,
and then we heard in the other podcast about how you totally burn out. That's the whole other story, other side of that story, right?
Yeah. That's
and then you have to turn to Ayurveda to figure out how to eat right. And everybody can go listen to it. It's really good. But you just described that moment. I remember the other podcast, and then there was a flip side as well, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But one of the real gifts that I got when I was based in the US was because, so we worked with, truly global organizations, and, the head offices were often in New York, but they wanted what we were providing to them there to be offered throughout the States or into other countries. And particularly when they were working with their senior management teams in other countries, they actually preferred that I went and worked with them because of that I didn't have an American accent. So I was, perceived as being more international and more neutral or something. I trained and worked with people in, South America and Europe and Eastern Europe and Africa. I went 7 times to different countries in Africa, and it was incredible. And you know what I learned, Jay, which was, you can only, I'm so blessed to have had this experience, was that at the end of, there are cultural differences, absolutely, cultural norms and expectations. But at the end of the day, people are people are people. Mm-hmm. And so the transition for all of these materials from the corporate world to the yoga world, they're very much, they are very appropriate because, yoga professionals, but also our yoga students are people. They have the same needs fundamentally.
Well, I think in the past, I definitely had, I would call them hang-ups when it comes to what you just said about like taking this coaching work into yoga. And I think the hang-up was I had this idea in mind that kind of stuff, like Rogan techniques or trainings that you were doing, that was sort of like stuff that corporations paid for to make their workers more efficient so they could better exploit them. I had this kind of like idea of like the intent of that is to help the corporations make more money, not necessarily help the people. But what I kind of came to is that ultimately what makes like workforce more efficient or better at their jobs is actually good human skills. You know what I mean? Like they don't have to be used to nefarious ends necessarily. And so, that was the hang up. But I can see how it does ultimately amount to, you can use those things to like, whatever, help corporations make more money, or you can just use them to like have deeper and better relations or be more effective at almost any job that you do, I would imagine.
Exactly. So I will say though, Jay, that when you say what's influenced what we work with both in our book and what I, train in my workshops and coaching and so forth, there's all of that time with Rogan, but there's also the work that Jill and I did in our own personal journeys after leaving Rogan. And they were different. They were diverse. So I joined Sydney and then gone to New York. Then she joined Melbourne and then gone to London. And when she when she left Rogan, her main work initially was executive coaching, but then she went to transformational coaching, and then she went into transpersonal coaching. And I
don't know what any of those things are. What you don't have to tell me. I'll have to get Jill on, and she can tell me what those are.
Jill.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But working more deeply with the whole person, I think, would be the best way to think about that. And working with the whole person, but not just as it affects their corporate experience, but as it affects them in their whole life. And so that was partly the work she was doing. And then at the same time, she was studying tantric philosophy and also meditation, and became a meditation teacher.
Okay, I see.
So that's what she was drawn to, and a lot of her wisdom from those years is in the book. In my case, I left because I had met and married the man of my dreams, and he'd been a widower. I inherited 2 children, so I became a mom overnight of a 9 and a 7-year-old, and then we had a 3rd child. So not too long after I was married, I decided, it became apparent that our children needed a full-time parent, and so I decided to focus on parenting, and that's where my yoga journey really deepened, because I was able to have a little more time with my practicing, which still in those days was mainly going to classes. And then I had a whole journey with my physical and mental health that, I probably wouldn't have survived without yoga. So, we were doing our own thing for 10 years. And in fact, the reason we came together was a chance meeting. I had relocated back to Sydney, Australia, from living in the US for 17 years with my husband and just our youngest. And I had met Michael Domenico, who at the Yoga Institute, and I was studying there. And I was in a cafe and I heard this voice behind me, and the voice said, "Lucy Strasser, is that you?" And that was my maiden name. And I turned around and I said, "Jill Danks, is that you? What are you doing here?" She was in the south of France last I heard, and here she was in a suburb in Sydney. And so, all of those years also, has informed our book, and then, or our teachings, and then also all of my yoga teachers, along the way, who I've just been so blessed to have some phenomenal mentors and teachers. And so, a lot of it comes down to context. Jay, you talk about, you think of potentially using some of these skills or techniques as being, manipulative or coercive or whatever. And, I can't speak to every organisation, but I think it's fair to say in the back end of the 21st century, people were appreciating what you were just saying before, that actually you're going to have more, productive workforces if they're happier in their work environment, and these sorts of communication skills will help the leaders create those environments to be, for people to be happier. So, the other final piece that informs is our experience as yoga teachers and yoga therapists and coaches of yoga people, and and then, teaching. And so going back to how we wrote the book, we started the book in 2015, and what would happen was we would be writing and we may develop some new materials. I would use them in the workshop and I would, road test them and see, how they landed. And so the other teachers that I've had in this process have been my students in the workshops, and listening to their questions and inquiries and curiosities and challenges. And, I love that.
Well, it seems very significant to me that you guys had that big chunk of time there where you went and just like had life and was a mom and had this yoga journey that you mentioned. And she went and did all the things that she did. And then when you come back and you look back at those sort of kind of techniques that you were doing at Rogent, it's 10 years in your rear view. Yes. And like you say, in a different context.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you decided to call the book Connecting. And, I wrote you this in the email. My question is about that title, because when I read the book, it is, there's lots in there, but it is very like, there's a certain pragmatism to it, which I really like. Yeah. And I guess my question is it, when you say connecting, is that about people connecting to what you're trying to communicate? Is that people connecting to you as a person, or is it both? Can those even be separated?
I think it's both, but it's connecting to you as a person first. Because if people don't feel comfortable with you, if they don't feel safe and they don't trust you, then they're unlikely to open up to experiences. So whether it's in a yoga class environment, in a group class environment, or whether it's working one-on-one to help somebody develop a personal practice, or whether it's in a yoga therapy context, that connection, that sort of felt sense of you understand me and you care about me, is critical for people to then start to either settle into being in their experience as a human being, like on a group class on a mat in a group class, or to open up and share relevant information to help you help them in a one-on-one situation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think for me that's sort of at the core of what I think happens in a yoga exchange in a way. There has to be that connection of that sort, like you say, where you feel like there's some trust or friendship between you. Otherwise, it's still working towards that. Before then, something else takes place, something more rewarding, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in terms of the connecting to whatever it is you're teaching or, information you're sharing or, process that you might be trying to take them through, that all starts with you seeking to understand what their needs are and if they're ready. Mm-hmm. Because if neither of those criteria have been fulfilled, then there's no way you can influence another person.
Isn't that right? Yeah, I was looking at the book when we were getting ready to talk, and I there was one section too, and this goes, I think, to the idea of connecting, the idea that your personal values play a really vital role. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What would you say what are some of the ways that your personal values play into your ability to communicate and connect with people?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I would say that I have a strong value that fundamentally believes we're all fabulous and wonderful as we are.
Amen.
and that also, and I don't know if this is a value but a knowing that everybody's different. And, that we all get our values because of the way where we were born, and how we were brought up, and then our sort of early childhood, our teenagers, then from our peer group, and then, choices that we've made along the way affect our values. And that there is no way that I, for example, just meeting with you, Jay, for the first time, could possibly appreciate what's going on in your head until I've asked a lot of questions and listened and allowed space and time for, things to arise. And so I guess that's a value in the belief in other people's wisdom, inner wisdom and knowing. Respect is a strong value for me, both to feel respected and also to respect other people for their journeys.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.